Welcome to the Property and Coffee Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Atkinson.
I'm Matt Skehan.
We'll be fueling your financial future one coffee and property insights at a time.
Helping you navigate the property market like a pro.
Hello, and what a pleasure it is to have your company on the Property and Coffee Podcast. We're going to be fueling your financial future one coffee and property insights at a time. I'm your host, Matt Atkinson, joined by my co-host, Matt Skehan.
Thanks, Matty.
Today, we're cutting through the complexity with a true expert, Kartik Lakhani, a Melbourne-based accountant. Kartik, welcome to the Property and Coffee Podcast.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for coming.
Pleasure to be here.
Before we get into it, we're just going to touch on our order of events, what we're going to be discussing on the pod, and then get started. So first up, we're just going to just be discussing between us some of the barbecue chat that's been going around in social circles. We're then, Kartik, going to be getting a bit more into your journey and the featured guest segments, understanding a bit around your business and how that's progressed since you started your career. And then we'll be wrapping up with some key insights and actionable items for everyone to take away. So let's get into it. One of the hot topics in the recent weeks has been around how some of the major banks, CBA and Macquarie specifically, have halted lending or curb lending into trust structures. So one of the items we wanted to unpack a bit on today is just one, the benefits of trust lending, and two, how people were using that previously from an investment perspective. Kartik, I'll throw this first one to you. So as an accountant, you would have been involved in assisting clients, just understanding trusts and help them set up a number of trusts. First up, for our listeners, what are the benefits while a family or an investor would look to set up a trust or use it as an investment vehicle?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one. I think that right off the bat, you would sit there and say that, look, trusts are not necessarily for everyone, but for those that are looking at investing, either continuing their investment journey or starting it, it's certainly something worth considering and looking into as to whether it would meet your requirements. The first thing to understand about trusts is that they are separate legal entities, right? So if a trust buys an asset, buys a property, it's not, say, Matt that owns the property anymore. It's the trust that owns the property. And Matt might very well be a trustee or a director of a trustee that sort of manages and runs that trust. One of the biggest reasons that people look at utilizing trusts as a vehicle to buy assets and buy properties is that it offers asset protection. So a trust is required to have a trustee, and that trustee can be an individual or it can be a company. And where you sort of bring in a company or a corporate trustee to be the trustee of that trust, you get a lot of the characteristics, or all of the characteristics of a company. And a company has inherently an asset protection mechanism to it in that it's a separate legal entity. The shareholders are not necessarily liable for the company's debts. Directors can be protected from company liabilities, assuming that they don't breach specific laws. And assets quite often are not exposed to personal lawsuits. So in that way, trust can be an excellent sort of vehicle to hold assets and protect those assets from a number of external sort of circumstances, if you like, arising. Another big advantage, and the one that everyone always talks about, is tax, right? You've got a lot of discretion and a lot of flexibility in terms of tax planning and tax outcomes. And trusts are also entitled to the CGT discount, a bit like individual investors as well. Another one is succession planning. So because the trust owns an asset, it means that it can be transferred across to the next generation without actually changing the ownership of that underlying asset. Now, we're about to go through, and I'm sure you guys have seen this in your businesses, that you've seen that, we're about to go through the biggest intergenerational wealth transfer ever, right? So imagine a situation where we can utilize these entities, these trusts, to transfer those assets without having to go through probate, without having to go through the entire sort of legal process of transferring assets. So I think from that perspective, it sort of works out really, really well. And probably the last one, and something I don't think a lot of people talk about, is that we deal with a lot of older clients, and for them, sometimes even just keeping track of their assets is a pain. Where's the bank account? Where's the cash? Yes. Where are the shares? Have I got chess sponsored shares, issuer sponsored shares? Have I got, under whose name is the property? Is it the husband, the wife, both Whereas when a trust owns it, that's the central location. You can sort of have all your assets located effectively in one place. So don't get me wrong, there are some disadvantages, but there are a whole raft of advantages. And I think talking to your accountant about whether it's suitable for your circumstances is definitely something worth looking into.
So Matt, in theory, how are investors encouraged to believe that using multiple separate trusts would lead to unlimited borrowing capacity?
I'm going to break this down into two parts. I might just journey back to remind everyone, when you're assessed for a mortgage, how that looks. So let's assume a family's got a household income of $200,000. When you go to a bank, they will stress test your position. What I mean by that is they'll make sure the expenses is appropriate for your scenario, and they will also potentially stress test, any debt you're taking on. So they assess your loan at a higher rate. They'll consider things like credit cards, personal loans that you may have. So for anyone that is looking to borrow, what that means is at some point, all things being equal, you will run out of borrowing capacity. Because when you buy another property, let's call it an investment property, the rental income will be shaded. The debt that will come on will be viewed in a higher rate. So all things being equal, at some point you won't be able to borrow anymore. And that's why we see, in terms of people that actually invest in property, there's less than 6% that hold 3 properties, and there is less than 4% that hold 4 properties or more. Going back to what Kartik has just spoken about, how a trust essentially, you sort of almost create a bit of a separation between yourself as a person or an individual, and then call it your trust entity. Looking at this specifically from a borrowing perspective is what certain lenders will allow you to do at a high level, provided that the income coming into the trust can cover the expenses. Some policy will allow you to exclude that trust in the borrowing in terms of from your personal capacity. What that means theoretically, when you're going and you're having your position assessed, if you have some properties that are in trust entities where the rent is covering the expenses, you would then be able to borrow more and buy more properties, obviously subject to to bank's policy. That's one of the ways. If you don't want to, I'll give an example: wait 10 years, pay down some debts, and then go again. People would look to use trusts to improve their position, and how you do end up finding people with multiple properties in terms of they've just spoken to someone like Kartik where they've structured correctly, and also not just structured correctly, but they've also bought well. They've got a good property where the yield's good, covering in an area, and they can then leverage off both the structure and the security to enable to them to go again, save up for that deposit and continue to purchase. That's one of the benefits outside a number that you've highlighted around asset protection, succession planning, and you can see it's a very powerful vehicle in terms of what Australians can use, provided you know how to use them correctly.
Cool. Thanks for that, Matty. So obviously, trusts have been in the news recently with obviously Macquarie and CBA curbing their trust lending. What were some of the factors cited by Macquarie for stopping this lending to trusts at the moment? It's obviously very topical. So,
yes, and I would expect some of the other banks I'd be surprised if they don't come out and have a bit of a view on this. The reasons may be a bit mixed depending on what bank comes through, but we'll use Macquarie in terms of this question. So you got to remember there's the anti-money laundering tranche 2 regulations which come out 1 July 2026. High level, that's going to require a bit more onerous around verification of things like identity and potentially the source of funds, which if you're in a trust structure can be, especially if you're using it for wealth management, asset protection, succession planning, can be a bit harder to work through. What that looks like from a lender's side is there's potentially an increase in risk if they don't address these correctly with the regulations. So if we look at someone like Macquarie, they pride themselves on, they're a very digital focused bank. They want to give their clients solutions and they want to be as fast as possible to do it. With these regulations and potentially some other reasons coming in, what that means for them is there may need to be more manual intervention around making sure they've assessed the risk correctly. That might mean they need more staff, but ultimately to bring on to help them with that. But also that might mean their timelines might blow out. So, it may just not fit in from their target market, and their architecture, what they geared for from a bank's perspective, necessarily fits into that. I would probably expect lenders across the board will be watching the space and then just working out what's the middle ground, how they would, be happy to continue lending in to trust structures with ultimately the appropriate people available to mitigate that risk. So for me, it's probably a bit of a wait and see. It's probably a topic we're definitely going to revisit.
Yeah, watch the space.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, KYC is a big sort of area for the banks as it is. I assume that this new legislation is just going to increase that requirement for them, which is effectively what you're talking about, then impacts the ability of everyone to potentially use these structures to get their loans done.
Well, that's it. And look, it seems to be more that I'd imagine the loan processing times or how that process goes might just increase. But again, like anything, banks, especially here, they'll be cautious. They'll find a bit of a middle ground. And there's so many Australians that use trust structures, and they are becoming so popular. So, I would assume they would revisit around how they want to lend in at some point, but they're probably just trying to work through that. And likewise, whether it be CBA or some of the other banks, even if they haven't come out publicly and stated it, they'll be making sure that as these approach, they geared and they have got the risks covered to make sure that they can lend appropriately.
Cool. Well, thanks again for coming on, Kartik. We appreciate it. We look forward to hearing you now. And most important question off the bat, mate.
Yep.
Favourite coffee? And where can we find you drinking it in Melbourne, mate?
So this is a very sort of an accountant answer, but I don't know. I think the older you get, the more you tend to get away from milk. So I'm more of a black coffee guy now these days. I remember when I first started my career as a junior accountant at Deloitte, it was a milky latte with like 6 sugars. Slowly transitioned away to just a latte, and now
From a hot chocolate almost.
From a hot chocolate. Well, it used to be the case of I'd go out with my girlfriend and she'd order her coffee and I'd order a hot chocolate or an orange juice, and I'd say, "Look, can you just put it in front of her?" And then it's do a bit of a swapperoo when the waitress had left, but. No, look, it's definitely a black coffee. And to be honest, these days, with the cost of living, it's more than happy to have a good machine at the office or at home and make a black coffee right then and there.
Nicely done. You got if you have some quality beans, it's that'll do the job, no problem.
Absolutely.
Coffee capital, aren't we, Melbourne? So we've got lots of good beans around. So
absolutely, yeah. I'm a St. Ali guy myself, but look, yeah, lots of good coffee. Can't go wrong.
Well, let's start with your professional journey. So you've clearly had a successful career in the accounting space, and started off in the corporate space and then moving into essentially being a director in the family business. What drove you, one, to pick up the career and specialize ultimately in taking a key focus around in the finance and ultimately in the property space as well?
Yeah, look, I don't think anyone starts off their journey saying I want to be an accountant, or maybe even a mortgage broker when they grow up. So certainly not, probably not as cool as say being a firefighter or an astronaut, but sort of landed into it for lack of a better idea at university. And Dad was an accountant, obviously ran his own practice, so I'm sure that had a part to play with it. But then I was fortunate enough to get a graduate position with, as I said, Deloitte, which was just a fantastic experience. You're in your 20s and the camaraderie that you form and the lessons that you learn. But look, I grew up around men and women that ran their own business from day dot. Both my parents, actually, my uncles, my aunties. So the idea of sort of joining the family business and being a part of that was too appealing at the end of the day. So I got my qualifications, did my CA at Deloitte, and then and jumped across. So so I eventually took over the chartered accounting practice from Dad. But when I say a family business, a real family business. We've got my older brother who's a full-time property developer, and that was great. That gave me a lot of exposure to that side of the business as well. And then me and my sister, she did her CA at PwC, but then again joined the family business, and we sort of run the accounting practice, and we also run an offshoring business for professional services. So I think running your own business was sort of in the blood, in the DNA, so to speak. And yeah, I couldn't imagine sort of doing it any other way. And I think it's something that small business is in the very fabric, I think, of the Australian society, Australian culture. But I think it is something which is becoming a bit more challenging for a number of people. So definitely an area of our practice anyway that we like to try and support small businesses as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, it's good to hear.
Thanks for sharing great insights, mate, and love that family-centric sort of business and philosophy. So thank you, Kartik. So,
no worries.
So you've mentioned already, but shifting to your personal portfolio, we often hear that accountants make the best investors. So can you share a key milestone or lesson from your own personal investment journey, whether that's the first step or something along the way? There's I think you learn by doing, right, rather than just is the key.
Yeah, 100%. Look, I think one of the key milestones for anybody in their investment journey is obviously buying that first property, whether it's a house or an investment property. I think once you're able to do that, and you know, particularly if you can do it well, the lessons you'll learn as to how it works, what it all means, you know, things like negative gearing and even just basically managing the property. I think that is always going to be a key milestone. It certainly was for me in terms of learning things like, you know, body corporate or, you know, how just borrowing works and serviceability and all the rest of it. So definitely that would have been, you know, for me anyway, probably the big milestone. I think once you get that done and once you understand that, I think then going on and purchasing more properties or assets or investments and things like that, it becomes probably a bit clearer as to what you're trying to achieve, what you're looking out for, and what the sort of the traps can be. So between, you know, my family and our investment partners, we've been involved in the buying and selling of dozens and dozens of properties. The biggest lesson that I learned is that understand or know what you don't know, right? Because, you know, buying a property can be quite a complex piece. So, you know, you need to really rely and get advice from the people and experts that have the relevant experience. You know, the median property price in Melbourne today is just shy of $1 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Yeah.
So, you know, I think if it's done right, it can really generate a tremendous amount of long-term and multi-generational wealth. But you have to have the right team behind you. You know, a good buyer's advocate to help you select the property, a great mortgage broker who takes the time and effort to understand your specific financial situation and which lenders are most appropriate, right? It's quite a complex thing. A great accountant who can give you the best advice around tax and structuring, which is sort of what we've touched on a little bit. And finally, really a great lawyer or conveyancer. I think, you know, that's almost one of the most essential pieces here because contracts are quite complex and you need someone to really review that before you sign on the dotted line. But yeah, I mean, that's, you know, you sort of mentioned learning lessons before. The biggest learning lesson is know what you don't know. So, you know, even as me as an accountant, there's so much that I don't know. You know, I'd go to my lawyer or I'd go to my mortgage broker, my financial planner, whoever it is, and ask the question.
Yep.
I can only imagine that if you're a doctor, a dentist, a tradie, you know, if you don't have those experts around you, how are you going to manage? So that to me is the biggest learning lesson and the biggest sort of piece of advice I would give to anyone buying property.
Yeah, no, you're right. You just want to have the team around you. And look, everyone's got different, as you rightly say, different focuses and different areas of expertise. And you just want to make sure when you're going into this space that ultimately you've got those people that can fill in the knowledge gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if there's some work required around the house, I'll call the tradie. Doesn't matter what my life
Play to your
is.
strengths, mate.
Play to your strengths.
Oh, that's it. Don't be too proud. So for our listeners, large majority are high income earning professionals and business owners. Often they're time poor, but looking to build their wealth. In your experience, what is one of the most effective levers that they should be pulling right now to, you know, maximize their financial position for property investments?
Again, I think it's going to be around getting that team in place and getting that sort of great team who, you know, I mean, you'd be surprised how effective it can be, particularly if you're time poor and looking to build wealth through property, to engage that team even before you decide to buy that property. So, you know, you really need to engage with these specialists in the lead up to making an investment. And again, the easiest example is, talking to your mortgage broker. What is my borrowing capacity? How do I structure this so that I can go again? Yes. These are the levers that will allow you to enter into the market in the most efficient, time-effective manner. And I think if you don't have that advice going into it, you're almost going into it blind. So, you know, if you're a high-income earner, you're time poor, you're really looking at buying wealth. Like we deal with in our practice, we have a lot of medicos, you know, clients that just, you know, they're busy doing what they need to be doing, which, you know, is to the benefit of all of us. Last thing they need to be worrying about is, well, what is my serviceability? How do I structure this? What am I doing? You know, and it's not just, you know, I use the example of medical clients. You could be any sort of trade or vocation, but, you know, without that advice, how do you know when to, you know, go ahead, pull that lever? What can I buy? What can I afford? I think everyone knows that they want to build wealth. Everyone knows that they want to go ahead and make the best possible life that they can make. They want to leave as much to their children as they possibly can. But, you know, without that right advice, without that right starting point, particularly, I think it's a very difficult thing to do.
Because also, I mean, we'd all appreciate, you know, so Matt, I'll use you as just being on the front line. First thing you're probably going to ask someone is, what's your price range? You know, have you got your finances improved? Or ultimately, if we're getting into more complex trust, is everything set up? Because we all know, you like a property, you see it, no one's going to wait for 4 weeks. You know, you need to be able to be in a position where you can make an active decision.
And I think also understanding things like, you know, what impact does a study loan or a HECS have? What impact does a credit card have? What impact does having children have on my borrowing capacity? All these sort of things, you know, play into what decision am I making next. So I think, great. Look, if you've got the time to look into these things and do the research, great. But if you are time poor, and particularly for a lot of high income earners, you know, you just don't have the time to look into these things. So yeah, I know I sort of might have said it previously, but yeah, again, that's just that having the right team around you is essential, I think, in ensuring that you're maximizing your financial position and your ability to purchase.
Makes complete sense, mate. I think, you know, as I said, it's a champion team, eh? Beats a team of champions. So yeah, you just got to leverage that expertise. So just segueing now to self-managed super funds, because obviously that's, again, another hot topic. So
love SMSFs.
You love SMSFs or Smurfs?
Love SMSFs. Like, it's very interesting.
Yeah,
very interesting area.
So for people who are with a healthy balance, looking for control and long-term asset growth, like from an accountant's viewpoint, what are some of the primary pros of using an SMSF to invest in, particularly in property, or, you know, obviously commercials favoured a fair bit as well, but what are the sort of from your end, obviously, because you're a key component of the self-managed super fund?
So I think, obviously, one of the biggest advantages that SMS has is that they're taxed concessionally, right?
Yep.
That is, they're taxed at a much lower rate. So, you know, rental income is taxed less, capital gains are taxed less, you know. The tax rate of an SMSF is 15%, or, you know, if it's a capital gains tax, you know, if it's held longer than 12 months, it'll be 10%, or if you're in retirement, it can be as low as 0%. You know, again, you know, when people hear that, they go, what, 0%? Yeah, it's, you know.
There's not much in free, is it? It's not like the taxes everywhere, right? So, you know, you breathe and, it's tax.
And I think that's why you sort of look at it. Super is very much in the news on a almost daily basis as to how governments are viewing it and looking at it. But absolutely. And I think in terms of commercial property, you know, they can you can get great returns out of it. And over a period of time, you can really generate a lot of wealth. Another massive advantage is for business owners. So when you talk about commercial property particularly, you know, your SMSF can be used to purchase the premise that you're operating out of. Right? So such as your office, your factory, your warehouse. You then rent that premise from your SMSF, meaning that your rental payments are actually going towards paying off an asset that ultimately you own, right? So that's probably one of the biggest advantages for business owners, particularly insofar as commercial property is concerned. You know, it can provide stability in terms of tenancy, right? So for a lot of businesses, they want that stability for, where's my business being run from, which office or warehouse or factory, you know, the business is located from. So that's another sort of really big play, I think, that business owners can implement as part of their operations. And yeah, a lot of predictable income to the SMSF as well in terms of rent. So there's benefits both for the SMSF as well as the business.
You got that almost vested interest when you're renting it back to yourself. You know, generally speaking, probably going to take care of it a little bit better, you know, although it's potentially owned through ultimately a trust structure. But it's yours and you look after it and such. Probably the only other thing from my side, just to add on and journeying back a bit around, ultimately it's a different trust structure than what we were discussing previously. But super, again, sits separate to you as an individual. So people that have maxed out their borrowing capacity and they still want some property exposure and they've got that healthy balance, people also having a look and seeing how they can get that exposure through self-managed super fund under the right circumstances.
Absolutely. And also, that whole piece around sort of asset protection is another area. Like, your SMSF would typically have a corporate trustee. It's separate from everything else. So it can be a great little way to get that asset protection as well.
Perfect. Maybe moving away from all the positives that the self-managed super funds have.
It's all rainbows.
Have got set up. That's
all good.
There's obviously a number of things and how they set up. People. The government wants to make sure people's retirements are protected, and largely so. Will definitely be a compliance piece and things people need to be aware of. So if we look at maybe on the other side, the negatives or the cons. Is there any hidden traps you see investors, potentially falling into? That we should be highlighting and people should be aware of if they're looking to invest through their self-managed super fund?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think I'll probably come back to that compliance piece in a second, but probably one of the big ones is that, look, one of the main reasons we love investing in property in Australia, when I say we, I mean Australians, is that we have negative gearing, right? Which allows us to offset the tax loss, either actually created as a cash loss or as a result of non-cash deductions. We love that negative gearing piece and that ability to offset, that loss against our taxable income, get a bit of a refund back, and hopefully continue to see that property grow as the years go on. It's one of the most well-traveled tax strategies, that we have. The problem in the SMSF space is that we're not paying a lot of tax in the first place. So if we've got a highly negatively geared property in that SMSF space, are we getting the best tax benefit by having it in an environment that's only taxed at 15% versus, 30 or 40% or more
Your margin.
in our marginal tax rate in our personal name. So that's one thing. The other thing is obviously when you buy property through super, you are investing a whole bunch of your super in one single asset.
Yes.
You talk to any financial planner and they'll tell you the biggest thing is diversification, right? So you're potentially going to miss out on that and create some liquidity issues potentially if cash is required in the SMSF for one reason or another. So there are definitely some downsides. And as you sort of mentioned earlier, was a compliance aspect. So, I mean, the SIS Act is quite robust, let's call it, in terms of the rules and sort of regulations that are in play. I'll give you the example of we were talking about before. If you're a business owner renting the premise from your SMSF to yourself, the rules are very, very stringent. It has to be market rate of rent. Everything has to be on arm's length and maintained on arm's length. And I think the problem with obviously SMSF or SIS compliance in general is that if you don't get it right, the implications, it's quite punitive.
Yes.
So, you've got to be careful there. But again, I think a lot of those risks can be overcome by having the right advice and the right team around you, to ensure that you keep your SMSF, if you have one, compliant. And I think ultimately everyone's situation is different. It's not going to be for everyone, but those that have that requirement, absolutely, it can be a very powerful way to build wealth and build wealth in a concessionally taxed environment. I think that's the key. Very few environments are taxed as concessionally as super. So yeah, definitely something to have a look at if you're interested in that space.
And ultimately, probably the overarching comments around what you're building is, we want to make sure people's pensions or super is protected. So when you retire, you've got that nest egg. And I know sometimes people say to us, there's a bit of a burden around paperwork and compliance. And look, part of that is you can get professionals across it and help you set up those structures. But ultimately, it's to make sure that when you get to retirement age, you've made some good choices around if you're looking at property, and you can obviously see those enjoy those fruits of your hard labor around working and not be sitting with something that's a poorly performed asset over 30 years, which can be quite damaging.
Well, yeah, super is a long game, right? And I think it's sort of, that's where that intersection of super and property can work out quite well, and that property is a long game too.
Yeah. So
yeah, you have to play that long game. You have to make some really good choices in terms of the property you're buying, the location, the yield, things like this. And again, it sounds, I don't know, I'm sounding like a broken record here, but just coming back to that team, you're talking to you with the right advisors around you to help you choose the right asset. And I think that's actually where, as an example, buying property in SMSF, the buyer's advocate really sort of shines through in the sense that, you're not buying some, there are when you look at properties, you look at properties with obscene body corporates, you look at properties with, it could be a whole raft. Are there any building issues? Has the lawyer properly reviewed the contract? Like there's so many, I shouldn't say dud properties, but look, you've got to be very careful in the sense that there are properties which are not great to hold either in the short term or in the long term and can cost thousands and thousands of dollars to maintain. So I think you really utilizing that team, and in this instance, as an example, the buyer's advocate, to really select high quality property that will do well over time and will give a decent return both from a capital growth perspective and hopefully from a rental perspective. Yeah, I think it can work out really well, and that's what you need to keep your eye open for.
100%, mate. I've seen many client who, particularly because it's a self-managed super fund, it's at arm's length as well, get targeted by unscrupulous people as well, right? And the asset selection really goes astray. And I think that's, as you said already, if all your money's invested into that asset, if it doesn't perform, well, then you obviously it can magnify the downside, right? So
100%. Yeah. And as you said, there are those people, sharks, if you will, in the property industry that'll look to sell anything and everything. So, we work very closely with a select group of buyers advocates when we're, talking to clients, and we're sort of referring clients on to sit there and say, look, these are the buyers advocates that are have a good reputation, have worked well. Other clients of ours have used them in the past. For us, particularly for our accounting practice, referring on to the best possible team in terms of buyers advocates and mortgage brokers and whatnot is absolutely essential. So again, in that instance, and particularly when it comes to buying in an SMSF, when we are talking about your retirement, what you're going to live off when you can't earn anymore, I think it becomes particularly important.
100%. So lots of gold nuggets in there, mate. So so from a structuring perspective, is there a key difference between purchasing residential or commercial property with an SMSF, and is there any tax implications, I suppose, for renovations or eventual sale in any of these different forms?
In terms of residential versus commercial, not necessarily. I think you do have to be careful if it is a related party leases in place. You definitely need to ensure that is done correctly. In terms of, renovation, again, if you're borrowing to buy property in the SMSF, you potentially have to be careful around renovations and changing the nature of underlying assets, whether they be commercial or residential. So there are some SIS rules which you have to be very, very wary of when getting into that space. But look, in terms of fundamentally, buying either residential or commercial, there's probably not too big a difference in the way that the underlying fund is structured. Just nuances around commercial property and residential that you should, again, probably just be mindful of when looking at what type of asset makes sense for you to acquire in your SMSF.
And probably on the view, as you said, long-term hold, when you're looking to purchase, you want to make sure that if you're chasing residential or commercial from an investment perspective, that as the client, you're not going to want to chop and change 18 months in and, continue to sort of sell and purchase again.
Yeah, I think buying property in general is again, it's a longer play. Like it's not a it's when you factor in the transactional costs of buying and selling between stamp duty and commissions, bearing in mind that there are some now stamp duty concessions available for commercial property.
Yes.
But the transactional costs in general of buying property are quite high, and so if you are buying property or you're looking to get property exposure, the idea should be that yes, it is a long-term play, and therefore you buy accordingly and you structure accordingly.
Oh, true. So, as a broker, typically the strategy, and we'll use SMSF in this case, would start with their accountants or a conversation between the clients and their accountants. And we've also heard, the setup and compliance piece can be costly in terms of just making sure those structures are up and running and compliance is appropriate. Is there a point in terms of if I want to call it a savings element or net wealth, where you would say to your clients, we're probably at a point where it's appropriate to be considering a self-managed super fund investment, and that we're looking to go down that route? So
you've got to be, even as us for accountants who use mortgage brokers, we've got to be careful in terms of, not giving financial advice and recommending necessarily. But, when you talk about minimum balances and things like that, everyone has an opinion. I think ASIC says, 200 odd K. I've had someone say 250 to 300 K in terms of super balance before it becomes feasible. for me, I try to start the conversation not with what balance makes the most sense, but rather what is my investment strategy and what is my situation. So if, as an example, I have a small amount of super, but let's say I have enough to purchase a warehouse that I rent already in my business, right? Then perhaps setting up an SMSF makes sense to buy that warehouse, even if my balance is, I don't know, 100K or whatever the case might. Maybe it doesn't meet the sort of suggestion that ASIC or sort of other commentators give. Conversely, maybe I've got a huge amount of super, but the type of property I want to purchase is highly negatively geared, and I could really get some more tax benefit by owning that property outside of super.
Yeah.
Maybe in my personal name or via trust. In that case, maybe it doesn't make sense to just look at the balance as the reason as to why I should buy or not buy property. So I think probably the better way of looking at this is that when you're looking at your overall investment journey, what are my objectives? What assets make sense? And am I in a position to buy? And if the answer is, yes, I am, it makes sense to use my super to buy this particular type of property. And I've made money in property before. I know the area quite well. And even if your balance isn't necessarily at where ASIC or someone else might recommend, maybe it makes sense. But as I said, you could have a $3 million super balance, but you're looking at buying a property which isn't really suitable to the SMSF environment. Maybe it's not the best idea. So I think looking at balances and net worth probably isn't the best way to start the conversation. I think it's, really sitting and talking with your accountant and your financial planner and your mortgage broker and just getting an idea of, this is the situation I'm in. This is what I want to look at investing into. What is the best way to do it? And then, I would hope that a really good and robust conversation would include looking at, is using super a good idea in that context?
A great answer. That's ultimately starting with the purpose and the strategy, and then building back in terms of how you would support that, and then does it actually make sense to proceed?
Well, I think a lot of people, as an example, always come to us and say, hey, what's the best way to do this from a tax perspective? And I sit there and always go, well, was this the right asset that you want to purchase? Or what's the nature of the asset? And they go, oh, well, I haven't actually even thought about what asset I'm going to buy. Well, I think if you start,
question.
Well, I think tax is almost an output of the conversation, right? It's okay, we've decided we're going to do something. How do we do it well from a tax perspective? Not let's do something.
Not the driver.
It's not the driver of the conversation, or it shouldn't be. So similar sort of concept here with the SMSF is that, does it make sense to buy in the first place? Does the asset make sense? And then you sort of have a look at whether super is the right area to which to make that investment.
Oh, perfect.
Cool. So moving from the self-managed super fund into the property development space, I think you mentioned you've got a bit of background and your brother is in that as well. So can you share a bit of, or without going to specifics, can you walk us through the why or a core financial driver for moving into that development space? So I think I even know myself as an advocate, a lot of clients start off just with your passive investing, and then property development gets on the radar. But what's the why, I suppose, the driver of getting into that development space?
Well, I mean, I think for starters, obviously, as Australians, we love our property. But yeah, I mean, the key financial driver is always going to be one where, look, we can potentially maximize a particular investment by developing it into more than what it started out to be. So, it's an old house with a big piece of land, or if it's a piece of land or whatever the case, or maybe it's a property in which we've sort of built up a lot of equity over time and we want to convert into something more. The key financial drivers, financial for most people. It's a great way to generate wealth. But, with developments, it's always about risk versus reward. Property development is a capital intensive sort of exercise. And there are a number of risks: finance risks, town planning risks, construction risks. My brother took an interest in it, and I was quite fortunate, me and my sister both actually, in the sense that, we come from a financial background. We can really have a look at these transactions from a financial perspective. The numbers, so a good feasibility study, comparative market analysis, does the project make sense? It worked out quite well because my brother's not the best with numbers. He's a creative type. So for him, he'd be looking at the architecture and, what's a beautiful property in this area and how do we build that and sort of go from there. But yeah, look, the key driver is definitely financial. But also, we love the idea of just designing and building a high quality property, something that a family will live in for generations, or at least years to come. Something which is built well will stand the test of time. So there is definitely a satisfaction and a driver in terms of creating something.
Yes.
I think it's difficult for us now as individuals to create something.
It is.
We don't create a lot of things. You know what I mean? So I think property is definitely one where, people can actively be part of creating and making and building something, if you like. So that's definitely something we enjoy. In addition to, obviously, you need to make a profit, right? And for a lot of clients that we have, as an example, it is about, hey, we've got a property which has a good amount of equity, which we've held for some time. What's the best way to maximize this investment and exit? Is it to sell it as is? Is it to develop it? Maybe we put two dual-lock townhouses on it, or whatever the case might be. So again, looking at those numbers really to sort of assess whether it makes sense is of pivotal importance. Yeah,
you're right, and especially when, like you're sort of sitting behind and looking at the numbers. Even if you're picking out a few different details, you feel like you've definitely put your personal touch on a few deals. Sort of numbers aside, is something about because everything feels like it's to an extent created, right? So everything's been invented, if you will.
Well, I mean, I'm not a creative type, so I mean, when the architects come in and start designing stuff, and I'll disappear. My brother loves it. Funny thing is, my wife loves getting involved in that sort of stuff. She'd be like, "What, a European laundry? No, you need a proper laundry so that they can come in from the garage and their kids can put their clothes in the washing machine."
Practical is important. Happy wife, happy life with property, mate, isn't it?
Absolutely. So she'll put her stamp sometimes on some of our developments, which is good. And now my brother will, I'll walk past my brother's office and I'll hear him on the phone to my wife. "What are you doing talking to my wife?" He goes, "I'm just getting some advice on where we're going to put the laundry or the finishing for the kitchen, whatever it is." And off you go type thing. So it's good fun.
So from your perspective as a chartered accountant, just looking at whether it be this deal or something else, what are some of the critical financial and structuring decisions involved in a development deal that you should be considering if someone's looking to embark on this journey? Yeah,
so in terms of the financial, probably the most important thing is to make sure you're making money. I know it sounds obvious, but it's something that people just assume sometimes, when they're looking at development. So, and the easiest way to do this is to create a feasibility study, which covers off all the costs as well as what you're going to sell the property for. You can almost think of it like a little profit or loss for that development that you're doing. It'll generally also cover off things like the expected debt required and therefore the expected equity you need. So the cash that you actually need to get the development done. And this is probably one of the most critical aspects because it will determine whether you're going ahead or not. And if you are either an experienced developer or a budding developer, but you don't spend much time on that feasibility study, engage either your accountant or a finance person or an accountant with a background or with experience with feasibility studies. And it can definitely help. And if the feasibility stacks up and we're going ahead, next step, as you sort of alluded to, is to get the structure right. Now, this is really important because once you've bought property, either if you're holding it, like we were talking about before, or if you're doing development, it can't be easily changed without triggering stamp duty, potentially income tax, potentially even GST, right? Typically, we will use trust structures with corporate trustees. And again, this can vary and be quite complex, but you need to make sure you're talking to your accountant to structure correctly to ensure that you're getting the right sort of tax implications, you're getting the right holding structures. If you try and change down the track, it can be very expensive to do so. Other issues you need to look at is things like the application of GST and the margin scheme. This is something we see a lot of people and a lot of conveyancers, funnily enough, get wrong. They don't necessarily have the best understanding. So, again, that comes back to choosing the right lawyer, conveyancer, to sort of really look at these aspects, contract aspects as well.
Familiar with the type of transaction that you're embarking on.
They've got to have experience and a background. And if you don't, again, it can be very expensive for the developer, for the investor, if things go pear-shaped. You can also look at things like the use of bucket companies and trusts in terms of handling profit distributions. Again, can be quite complex. If done correctly, though, can be quite impactful in terms of saving on tax and funding future developments as well. Obviously, the less money that we're paying in tax, the more we're minimizing it, all within sort of the right means and the right ways, the more we can put towards future developments, potentially future borrowing. So it is a very important area of development to structure correctly, and in such a way that you achieve the right outcomes. So,
Perfect.
Thanks, Kartik. So just sort of wrapping that up, and I think you've sort of touched on a bit there, but we've talked about it already, but development can be highly profitable, but also carries significant risk. What is the single biggest accounting or tax-related pitfall for a budding developer? I think you touched on a few things before, but what for the newbie, what's sort of the one?
Feasibility studies. I mean, that's not necessarily specific to tax.
Yep.
But, if you're not across how much you're likely to be spending and how much you're likely going to get at the end when you sell these properties, it's going to basically be the first thing you have to do, which will tell you whether you're going ahead or not going ahead. And if you don't get that process right, if your feasibility is wildly inaccurate, or you just haven't considered, everything that you need to consider, maybe if you haven't factored in a contingency, which is something that quite often lenders and developers developments will be looking for when reviewing. And that's the other thing. I think a lot of the time lenders can also review those feasibilities at times. So the biggest thing for me is just getting that feasibility right, and really it'll then lead into a lot of the other decisions you're making in terms of construction and town planning and all the rest of it. So yeah, that'd be the big one.
Makes a lot of sense, right? Failing to plan is planning to fail. So I think if you don't start off well, it's you don't want to chase your tail. So that's good words. Appreciate that. So
No worries.
Kartik, thank you for coming on to the podcast this afternoon. It's been great having you along, talking, benefits of trusts, what we're looking at when we're investing in self-managed super funds, and also just a bit about your property development story. I guess if you want to call it the family affair in terms of the property developments and how everyone's chipping in and helping out and getting some of those. So thanks for sharing those insights. I know there's going to be quite a few, sort of valuable bits of information there for our listeners to unpack a bit more, and hopefully also just understand a bit more that, self-managed super funds, they can be also seem a bit scary, but once you get that team around you, get that compliance piece under control, it can be a pretty powerful vehicle as you head into your later years.
No, thank you for having me, Matt.
Thanks, Kartik.
But as I said, get the right team behind you, and then you'd be surprised what is achievable. Yeah.
If you would like to keep receiving property insights and golden nuggets from our guests, please do follow us, and you'll get the latest episode released on a fortnightly basis.